Graham Langley sat in his sleek corner office, staring at the latest set of customer complaints. His luxury car service had built its reputation on excellence, but lately, the feedback had been troubling. Drivers arriving late, rude service, unclean vehicles, things he never tolerated. He had built this company from nothing, starting over 15 years ago with a single black sedan and a dream. Now, his business had expanded to 15 locations across the state, with hundreds of drivers, dispatchers, and managers working under him. But somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with the people who made it all happen. Reports from upper management didn't give him the full picture. He needed to see the truth for himself. That's why he sat in the backseat of a modest sedan outside one of his busiest branches, adjusting his disguise in the rearview mirror. A little gray in his hair, glasses, a slightly different way of speaking, nothing too dramatic, just enough to pass as a new trainee. The plan was simple. Go undercover as a rookie driver, see how the company truly operated, and find out who was hurting or helping his business. He stepped inside the branch office, where a bored-looking receptionist glanced up from her phone. "You the new guy?" she asked, barely interested. "Yeah," Graham said, keeping his voice steady. "Just got hired." She waved him toward the back, where a stocky man in a wrinkled polo stood with his arms crossed. "You're late," the man grunted. "I'm Derek, the manager here. Let's go. I don't have time for chit-chat." Graham resisted the urge to point out that he was on time. Instead, he simply nodded. Derek barely glanced at the training materials as he tossed a company jacket at him. "You'll be shadowing one of our senior drivers today. Try not to mess up." Graham followed him outside, where a tall, broad-shouldered man leaned against a black SUV. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were kind. "You must be the newbie," the man said, offering a handshake. "I'm Marcus." Graham took his hand. "Nice to meet you." Marcus opened the car door and motioned for Graham to get in. "All right, kid, let's see what you got." The first few rides were smooth. Graham observed how Marcus handled everything. His driving was sharp, his customer service impeccable. He greeted passengers with warmth, opened doors for them, and even kept a stash of mints and water bottles in the car. But as the day wore on, Graham noticed something odd. Marcus was going out of his way to take extra trips that weren't on the schedule. A quick detour here, an unplanned stop there. At first, Graham thought maybe he was running personal errands. But when Marcus pulled up to a small diner and stepped out, Graham's curiosity got the better of him. He followed behind, watching as Marcus greeted an elderly man sitting alone at a table. "Hey, Mr. Patterson," Marcus said, setting down a takeout bag. "Got you your favorites today." The old man's face lit up. "You didn't have to do this, son." Marcus smiled. "I promised I'd look out for you." Graham watched in silence as Marcus sat with the man for a few minutes, chatting about the weather and old stories. As they got back in the car, Graham finally spoke. "You do this often?" Marcus hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah, Mr. Patterson used to be one of our customers. Drove him for years before he got too sick to leave home much. He doesn't have family, so check in on him when I can." Graham was stunned. This wasn't something Marcus had to do. It wasn't part of the job. Yet here he was, using his own time and money to take care of someone who had no one else. For the first time that day, Graham felt something shift inside him. Maybe this undercover mission wasn't just about finding problems. Maybe it was about finding the people who made his company better. The next few rides passed in silence, but Graham couldn't shake what he'd witnessed. Marcus had taken time out of his shift time that could have been spent making money to look after someone who no longer contributed to the company's bottom line. That wasn't something a typical employee did. It was something a leader did. But as the afternoon wore on, Graham saw a different side of the company. A call came in from dispatch, instructing them to pick up a high-profile client from a downtown hotel. Marcus acknowledged the request, but the moment he hung up, tension settled over him. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, exhaling through his nose. The hotel was an upscale, glass-fronted building with a valet station out front. As they pulled up, a man in a tailored charcoal suit was already waiting. He barely glanced up from his phone as Marcus exited the car and opened the door for him. The moment the client slid inside, the atmosphere shifted. He barked out an address without so much as a greeting. Graham, seated in the passenger seat, immediately picked up on the subtle change in Marcus's demeanor. His grip on the wheel tightened, his jaw set. Traffic was slow-moving, and it wasn't long before the client let out an exaggerated sigh. He leaned forward, staring at Marcus through the rearview mirror. The client's irritation escalated as they inched forward. He muttered something under his breath, then leaned back and made a call. His voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet cabin. Marcus remained silent, his posture stiff. Graham could tell he was used to this. When they finally reached the destination, the client barely waited for the vehicle to come to a full stop before pushing the door open. He stepped out, then turned back. Marcus had already climbed out to retrieve the man's briefcase from the trunk, but before he could hand it over, the client snatched it without a thank you and strode away. Marcus let out a slow breath, watching the man disappear into the building. Then, without a word, he got back in the car and pulled away from the curb. Graham studied him. There was frustration there, but not surprise. After a few minutes, Graham spoke. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, shaking his head slightly. His voice was even, but there was an edge to it. Graham let the conversation drop, but he had already seen enough to know that something was wrong. As the evening rush picked up, dispatch called in another trip. This time, they were sent to a different part of town, where business executives often booked last-minute rides. When they arrived, a middle-aged man in an expensive watch and a navy blue overcoat stepped out of a towering office building. He was on the phone, gesturing impatiently. Marcus got out to open the back door, but the man barely acknowledged him. He slid inside, still talking, his voice clipped and authoritative. The moment the car pulled away from the curb, the man ended his call and turned his attention to Marcus. His question came out as more of a demand. Marcus responded with the same level of professionalism he had shown all day, but Graham could already tell where this was going. The man scoffed, shaking his head as he checked his watch. Graham watched the exchange closely. Marcus remained composed, but the tension in his shoulders was unmistakable. The man continued, his tone growing more condescending with each comment. Marcus didn't respond. He simply nodded and focused on the road. By the time they reached the destination, Graham had heard enough. As Marcus stepped out to open the door, the client tossed a bill onto the seat without looking back. He strode away without so much as a glance. Marcus picked up the bill, folded it neatly, and pocketed it before getting back in the car. Graham finally broke the silence. Marcus let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. Graham leaned back, watching him. Marcus hesitated, then exhaled. Graham frowned. Marcus shrugged. Graham sat with that information for a moment. As they drove back toward the branch, Graham's mind worked through everything he had learned. There was a deeper problem here, one that went beyond just rude customers. He was starting to see why the company's reputation had started slipping. Graham sat in the passenger seat, absorbing everything. Marcus drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. There was a weight in the air, an unspoken exhaustion that had nothing to do with the long hours. As they pulled into the lot behind the branch, Marcus parked near the employee entrance and let out a breath before shutting off the engine. Graham watched as he rubbed his temples, pressing his fingers into his forehead for a moment before finally speaking. He asked about the unpaid overtime, not accusing, just curious. Marcus hesitated, then let out a dry chuckle. Graham kept his expression neutral, but inside, the frustration was building. Marcus shifted in his seat, glancing toward the building. It was clear Marcus had accepted it as just another part of the job, but Graham knew better. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. Before he could say more, the back door of the building swung open and Derek, the branch manager, stepped outside. He scanned the lot before his eyes locked onto Marcus. His voice carried across the parking lot, cutting through the quiet. Marcus's jaw tensed. He didn't move right away, but after a beat, he pushed open the door and stepped out. Graham followed, moving a few steps behind. Derek crossed his arms as Marcus approached. Marcus didn't react, but Graham noticed the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides. Derek let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. Marcus kept his voice steady, but there was a tightness to it. Derek's lips curled in frustration. Marcus stayed silent. Derek turned, heading back inside without waiting for a response. Graham followed Marcus toward the break room, where a few drivers were gathered. Some sat at the small table, others leaned against the counter. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that settled in a place where people had learned not to expect things to change. One of the drivers, a younger man with tired eyes, glanced up as Marcus walked in. Marcus gave him a nod before heading to the small fridge and grabbing a bottle of water. The younger driver hesitated, then spoke. Marcus exhaled, twisting the cap off his bottle. The room fell into a heavy silence. Graham took a step forward, finally speaking. Marcus's brows lifted slightly, as if surprised by the question. The younger driver let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Graham had heard enough. He turned, heading for the door. Marcus watched him go, something unreadable in his expression. But Graham had made his decision. It was time to reveal the truth. Graham walked through the office with a sense of purpose, his disguise no longer necessary. The weight of what he had seen was heavy, but his decision was clear. Derek was at his desk, flipping through paperwork without much interest. He barely glanced up when Graham entered. Before Derek could respond, Graham pulled off his glasses and ran a hand through his hair, shaking off the slight disguise. The recognition was immediate. Derek's posture stiffened, his fingers tightening around the papers he held. Graham didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Derek opened his mouth, then closed it, scrambling to adjust his demeanor. Graham kept his eyes locked on him, waiting. Derek let out a forced chuckle, but it didn't land. Graham stepped forward. Derek's jaw worked as if he was searching for the right words, but none came. Graham turned away from him, walking toward the break room. The drivers who had been gathered there earlier were still present, but now they stood frozen, their conversations forgotten as they took in his presence. Marcus was leaning against the counter, bottle of water still in hand. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held understanding. Graham addressed the whole room. A few exchanged glances, uncertain, but Marcus held his gaze steady. Graham nodded, then directed his next words at him. Marcus exhaled, considering. Graham motioned for him to follow as he led the way back to Derek's office. The manager was still standing, his discomfort evident. Graham didn't waste time. Derek's face paled slightly, but he nodded stiffly. Graham turned to Marcus. Marcus hesitated, then spoke. Graham listened, letting him get it all out. When Marcus finished, Graham looked back at Derek. Derek swallowed hard. Graham didn't let him off the hook. Derek hesitated, then nodded again, but Graham could see it wasn't out of understanding, it was out of self-preservation. Graham made his decision. Derek's mouth opened, but no words came. Graham turned back to Marcus. Marcus blinked, caught off guard. Graham nodded once, then faced the rest of the drivers, who had gathered outside the office, listening. A murmur swept through the group, but Graham wasn't finished. The tension in the room shifted. Marcus stood quietly, processing, but Graham could see the change in him. Graham glanced at Derek once more. Derek gave a stiff nod and walked out. Graham exhaled, then turned back to Marcus. Marcus met his gaze, his expression steady. Graham gave a small nod. And with that, the company's future took a different path. The office was quieter now. The tension that had been suffocating the space for so long had started to lift, but there was still work to do. Graham wasn't the type to make changes and walk away expecting them to stick. He needed to ensure the shift was real, lasting. Marcus stood near the doorway, still processing everything. His posture was more upright now, no longer carrying the weight of unspoken frustrations. The other drivers lingered in the background, waiting to see what would happen next. Graham turned to one of the more senior drivers, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been quiet throughout the confrontation, but had observed everything closely. He had noticed the way she had subtly nodded when Marcus spoke, the way she had exchanged knowing glances with the other employees. She understood the deeper issues here. He asked her what needed to change. She hesitated for a moment, gauging whether this was a real opportunity or just another moment that would pass without action. But then she spoke, laying out the problems that had been festering for years. The scheduling system was broken, forcing employees to work unpredictable hours with little consideration for personal time. Management often ignored complaints about vehicle maintenance, leaving drivers to deal with customer frustration when a car wasn't up to standard. Dispatch pressure meant that Marcus added his thoughts, building on what she had said. Drivers weren't just employees in this business, they were the direct face of the company. If they were mistreated, it affected everything. Customers noticed when drivers were overworked, when they were frustrated, when they were forced to cut corners. Graham listened carefully, absorbing every word. This wasn't a minor issue, it was systemic. He made a decision then and there. The way things had been running was over. It wasn't enough to remove one bad manager and hope for the best. The company needed structural change, and it needed to start immediately. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Within minutes, the regional director was on the line. Graham didn't waste time explaining the situation in vague terms. He outlined everything he had seen, everything he had heard. He informed the director that they would be implementing changes across all locations, starting with this one. Management training would be overhauled, scheduling would be adjusted to provide fairness and predictability, and an anonymous reporting system would be set up so employees. The regional director didn't argue, he knew better. When Graham ended the call, he looked back at the room. The drivers were watching him carefully, waiting to see if this was just another empty promise. He assured them it wasn't. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded. He believed it. The room started to shift in energy. Conversations picked up again, but this time they weren't filled with frustration, they were filled with a cautious sort of hope. Drivers spoke to each other, discussing what these changes could mean. Some were skeptical, but others seemed ready to see if things would truly improve. Graham knew actions would speak louder than words. He turned to Marcus and asked him to stay behind for a moment. Once the room had emptied, Graham told him that his leadership hadn't gone unnoticed. Marcus had been doing the work of a manager without the title, without the pay, and without the authority to make real change. That was going to be corrected. Marcus didn't respond right away. He seemed to be turning the idea over in his mind, considering what it would mean. Finally, he accepted, but with one condition: he didn't want to become the kind of leader who ignored the people on the ground. He wanted to make sure that if he took the role, things would actually get better. Graham assured him that's exactly why he wanted him in the position. Marcus extended his hand, and Graham shook it. The first step had been taken, but there was still a long road ahead.